Tell me when it's live. Okay, good morning. I begin again with a tefillah and bracha. Hina le'yonam v'le'yishin Shem Yisrael. The Rebbe protects in everywhere, especially in Eretz HaKadosh. Eretz HaShareini Hashem Alekecha Bo Meresh HaShana V'Lach Rishana. So B'loshen Harav. The words of the Rebbe many times, especially in times of crisis, whether it was in Tavshin Chav Zayin or even earlier Tavshin Tez Zayin and Chav Zayin, Lamed Daled, Mem Beis, and many more times, that the Ibishter should make sure that every person is kept safe. We shouldn't hear any more tzar. And quickly, should all be Napach transformed into major Netzochen. The Rebbe's approach, which now is clear to everybody, and hopefully will remain clear, that you have to finish a war, you have to go all the way till the end. As I discussed last week, some of the Rebbe's approaches, I'm going to continue. But just to sum up a few of the key things that, especially in Lamed Daled, when the Rebbe spoke, to go into Damascus and to Cairo, and they were pretty close, and the Rebbe made it clear, we're not talking about conquering, we're talking just showing the enemy that you go, I'm using these words, you cut off a snake at its head. You have to show that you completely conquer the capitals of the enemies who attacked you. And that creates a whole different climate. I'm just comparing it, for example, unconditional surrender at the end of World War II. An enemy must know that they're completely destroyed. It's the only way you bring peace. And the Rebbe made it clear that he's talking about protecting not just Jewish lives, but also non-Jewish lives. Because every life is precious. So it's not some hawkish military approach. It's simply, unfortunately, in a world of darkness, a world of Golus, the Rebbe wants there should be some things done b'derech hateva, and that's the only way to deal with a true enemy, if they're proven to be a true enemy. We obviously would all love to hope that there are no enemies, but there are. And not by our choice, but by their choice. And that is something, just a very ugly truth that a lot of people don't like to hear. Look, let's be honest, psychologically, who likes confrontation? In your own personal life, if somebody does something that may offend you, most cases, unless you're really an aggressive person with a lot of anger, what do we want confrontation for? We minimize it. Many times we have to overlook. Ma'avid al midesov. But sometimes a person does something that really is not appropriate. And not mitzad teva odom that you are achzari, you're angry or something, like Tzemach Tzedek says, that the only reason you're coming to punish someone because you're an aggressive person. But al pitera, there's a time that you have to stand up, because if you don't show the enemy strength, they'll just come and attack you again. So it's not a matter of aggression, it's a matter of simple, normal protection. So there's times where we need to have confrontation. I'm just bringing a personal example just from our own lives. We don't like it. Nobody likes confrontation, especially on this scale. But you can't be in denial when you're dealing with millions and millions of people that call you their enemy, that have declared war on you. Achmon al-Itzlan, the korbanos we saw, the korbanos we've seen in the past, are a result of taking it for granted, of not letting your guard down. Not here to point fingers, not a time, the Rebbe would always emphasize, not a time, now is a time for Achdus, and only b'schusun, to speak only b'schusun shel Yisrael. But as we speak between ourselves, it's important to know this. And now, the hope is that, unfortunately, this has been such a terrible, brutal tragedy that it has woken up the right parties, and hopefully they will do what they have to do. And again, this is mitzvah shalom, not mitzvah Muhammad. Tonight I'm going to be on a radio show, and they wanted to title it, according to Torah, when is revenge or retribution? Revenge means nekama, and retribution means einish. Like, revenge, retribution is paying somebody what they did, punishing them. And I told the host, I said, from a Torah point of view, it's not revenge or retribution, it's protecting innocent people. Once you call it revenge or retribution, then right away you say, okay, so how much revenge you're going to have? Yeah, by Mechamas Midyan, the Eibishter says nekama. But that's the Eibishter's tzivui. But b'derech klal, in the case of pekuach nefesh, we don't call it revenge. If you attack someone who's broken into, God forbid, someone's house and is attacking your family, it's not revenge, and it's not retribution, it's pushed self-defense to save lives. And just to show how communication is critical, how people position things changes the whole picture. Look at all the misinformation going on, the bombing of this hospital. And now Pashta Sheker becomes an emes, and that's that. And that's why I think it's vital for all of us, not saying to follow the news, that's not our job, but anything that comes our way, we have to be able to have aces to explain. Yeah, you may say that, who are you, Mi'ani and Mo'ani? We're not here public figures that are going to reach millions of people. But nevertheless, everybody has their sphere of influence. You never know who you speak to. And you have to be armed with information. So with that, I want to go to another part that I didn't discuss last week. Didn't have time. Last week I covered more the Rebbe's approach b'chlal in the time of war, that there's also the spiritual war. I just saw a letter from the Refuting Rebbe in Tafshin Ches, Yudal Ir, basically right after the independence war, the first war in Eretz Yisrael, 1948, where the Refuting Rebbe writes clear that a war consists of begeshem u'beruach. You need both. And we have to do everything possible to support Achenu v'Achesenu b'nei Yisrael be'Eretz HaKodesh. Begeshem u'beruach. And he says it several times. Le b'chayav v'le b'keach ki im beruchi. And you can't have a successful war, begeshem, if you don't have a successful war, beruach. It's a very powerful letter. It's in Igris Kodesh. Look at the Yudal Ir Tavshin Ches. And of course, the Rebbe's emphasis was exactly the same point. And the Ruchnisdika part is in our hands. We can't do anything, we can't do as much in Gashmis, at least most of us, but the Ruchnisdika part. And there he calls for tshuva. But of course, we know all the mitzvahs that the Rebbe spoke about, mitzvah, tefillin, mezuzah, tzedakah, achdus, of course, chinuch, lepi elim v'yenkim yisad te'ez lahash b'seif v'misnakim. So that I spoke about last week, Bar Barichas. I also discussed Siman Shin Chav Tes. The Rebbe using the Hilchah Shabbos, practical halacha, but it's more than just halacha, it's an insight in how you fight battles. It's an insight how you look at enemies. And when there's an enemy, you have to mobilize even if the enemy is not attacking you. Because an enemy is an enemy, but peil mamish, even if there's no actual war. So I want to talk now about another side of this, which is critical as well, and there's so much misinformation about this as well. I'll just start with, I guess I call it a klotz kasha if you wish. I mean, we all wonder, it seems like crazy that there are people, seichel dika people, I'm not talking about terrorists and murderers, who are anti-Semites, that are able to go with a straight face that say that Israel's the criminal here, that Israel occupies the land, they oppress the Palestinians. And I'm not going to repeat all their tinus, it's not my job to do that. And people, intelligent people, including Leilenu Jews, many Jews. A mother just wrote to me that my daughters and I don't talk because they are completely anti-Israel. And every time we talk, it just becomes a war. So her own daughters, she asked me to pray for them. They should have ruach aleim ruach memorim. You look in academic circles, universities, not everybody, but enough. And you ask yourself, where are they coming from? What kind of images? It's like saying that the Nazis and the Jews were at fault. Something's the matter with you. So you could blame anti-Semitism. I'm sure there's part of that. There's anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism is not rational. In the media, look how fast they bought into the story that Israel bombed the hospital, even though complete check, they didn't even check it. Isn't that a media job to check at least? To be skeptical? And even now, you don't hear anyone in the media getting up and apologizing that we jumped the gun. So for sure there's anti-Semitic stuff, and that itself is a headline that should be emphasized. But there has to be also something more here. So I want to address that, not because we have to be al-tan la'ovel, al-tasavik and manuvel. We're not here to engage with people who are b'chlal, to debate people who are b'chlal irrational, and whatever you say, they're not going to respect anyway. But we have to know, da'amash toshiv, even if you don't answer, we have to know what's the approach here. And what's really going on here. And I think a lot of people, including even completely, obviously, Avi Yisrael and pro-Israel and all of that, are not always aware of all the details. So I would suggest that the Rebbe's emphasis on the first Rashi, or I should say the Rashi in the first pasuk in Chumash, about why, about Nachlas Goyim, where Koyach Maisav Higid La'ameh, Losses Lem Nachlas Goyim, the Rashi that the Rebbe emphasized many, many times, including, I just heard a clip, the Rebbe Poshet looking at Chumash, I think it was Membeis, not sure if anybody remembers what Sikh it was. The Rebbe Poshet looking at a Chumash in a video, and reading the Rashi inside, from beginning to end, and touched it with, Pirush Amilis. The Rebbe even corrects, he says, Nachlas Goyim, Lasos Lem Nachlas Goyim, Aretz. The Rebbe says, first he says the Welt, then the Rebbe translates it to land. The Rebbe stood Bashaf in the land, and it is Gem Eden. So, with the big qualification, the Rebbe made it clear that Shimon Shinchov Tes is not just in Eretz Yisrael. It's in France, in Hardar, that's the Lashon Gemara. It's in France, in England, anywhere in the United States. The same logic. If there's an enemy on your doorstep, on your gvul, on your boundary, you have to treat it as such. But Rashi, obviously, and Bereshit Bar is talking about Eretz Yisrael. So this Rashi, as much as we emphasize it, I think it's so when you really understand it well, you could see that Magdim Refu Lamaka, that how it responds to the questions I asked, what I discussed before as well. How people can have a different narrative, completely different than the one we embrace. So let me begin with a letter that Rebbe wrote to Shazar. So President Shazar, who was named after the Alter Rebbe and considered himself a chassid, came to see the Rebbe several times. Tav Shechavov, Chav Zayin, I think Lamed Gimel, that's president. I think Lamed Gimel he was already after being president. He was also by the Rebbe many times before he was president of Israel. Anyway, the letter is printed. The letter the Rebbe writes, Shazar writes to the Rebbe, a taina. Says the Rebbe addressed Shazar as president of Eretz Yisrael, not of Medinas Yisrael. So he writes to the Rebbe, why is the Rebbe taking away from me and forcing me to have to choose between being a chassid and between following the oath I took, oath of office, as president of Medinas Yisrael, not Eretz Yisrael. In other words, by the Rebbe writing Eretz Yisrael, the Rebbe is like causing him, is he a chassid of the Rebbe, then it's Eretz Yisrael, but he gave an oath to Medinas Yisrael. That's what he writes to the Rebbe. The Rebbe responds two things. The Rebbe says, firstly, you were a chassid before I was even born. So how could I take away your ability to be a chassid? That's what the Rebbe writes to him. And Beis, and this is the Iker, of course, the Rebbe writes to him, Adarab, Israel, or the Rebbe exactly, began in Shinches, 1948. Eretz is back 500 years. So making you far bigger president. You're a president of a land that's here for thousands of years. Now it's not Stama Melitza. What is the Rebbe saying? That the only right that we have to be there, really, Hapi Teira, is because the Eibishter gave the Eretz Yisrael to the Eden. Every person on earth calls it the promised land. There's a reason it's called the promised land. Because it was promised to Avram, Yitzchak, Yaakov. The Bible is considered the best-selling book. I'm speaking now even from the point of view of a secular audience. It's the best-selling book in history. Even though there are best-selling lists every week on books are bestsellers, they never put the Bible, but the Bible sells more than all the books put together every week. Today. It is the best-selling book. I checked it out. I'm an author, so I want to see who my competition is. So for the Bible, nobody can compete with. It sells, I don't know how many it sells. It's not even on the list, which is also another sheker. They call it a best-selling list. At least say the Bible is always the one. But nobody wants to say that, which may be based on what I'm going to say, makes sense. So the Torah says clearly that it's a promised land. Then the Eden were chased away. They had to go to Mitzrayim. They ended up in Golus. They came back 210 years or 250 years later, whatever the amount of years how you count it, after 40 years in the Midbar. And of course, who occupied the land? Occupiers. The Canaanim and the Shiva Omis. They refused to give back the land to their owners. And the Eden were owners, not just promised by God. We know Avraham Avinu bought Moras HaMachpelah because he wanted that no one should have tainus. It wasn't a gift. He didn't want a matana. He wanted it to be a purchase that should be contractual lease, like you buy a house. Someone gives you as a gift, they could always come back and say, Ephraim, it's a gift, now I want it back. He wanted to buy it. And all the other kinyanim that were made. So the Eden had no choice, they had to go to war. To go back to their own homes. Someone takes away your home. And then they lived for many years there. And they built up first Beis HaMikdash. And then the Babylonians, or the Assyrians destroyed Malchus Yisrael, then the Babylonians destroyed Bayis Rishon and exiled the Eden. 70 years, they came back, built a second Bayis for 420 years. And then the Romans, Malchus Edom, Golas Edom, exiled us for Kamat or Adayem Azeh. So this is basic history. This is not theory. Most people don't talk about that. That's the story. That's why it's called the Promised Land. So when the Eden started coming back, well, they always lived always Eden in Eretz Yisrael. When they start trickling back, we know the Shalah, the Ramban. How many Gedolei Yisrael, at the end of their lives, they went from Europe, they went to, or Europe, wherever it was, or Spain, they ended up in Eretz Yisrael. So it was always the She'ifa of Eden. We daven 3 times a day towards Mizrach. We say how many times in the Tfilis? The Shalayim, Volitzian, Sechzen Einenu, Lashon Hababi. I mean, all this are like pure historical facts. You don't need any theories. There's no debate about this. So it's been our life from the beginning. We never ever forgot it. It's Yisrael, Yerushalayim, for 1 second. You break a glass under every chuppah. I mean, I'm going to go on every minig that we have. It's full of Yiddishkeit. It's so saturated in everything we do. So then, the 20th century, or the 19th century, when Eden started making their way back to Eretz Yisrael, a little more, and then after the Second World War, we're going back home. Not occupiers, the whole concept doesn't exist. However, there's another narrative that cuts God out of the picture, and cuts Torah out of the picture. And they start history in the 19th century. 19th century, most of the population in what we call Eretz Yisrael today were Muslim Arabs. Then began a Zionist Congress, secular Zionists, began a movement of creating a homeland. And there's no God in the picture, there's no promised land in the picture. As a matter of fact, some Zionist leaders, Rahman al-Islam, suggested maybe Uganda, or Argentina, actually. Argentina was rejected right away, but Uganda. And then finally they realized that they're not going to Uganda. Right? Who was going to Uganda? But bottom line is that this is another narrative. It's the same narrative, we'll call it the narrative of the Maskilim and the Haskalah movement, that cut out God, because religion, Judaism, Christianity, all religion is archaic, it's old-fashioned, it's biblical, that's not for the modern world. We don't need God. It's a new narrative. Science has replaced religion. I don't want to go into all the details, but this is a major shift that happened in the 17th, 18th century. Basically, when Chassidus was born, Baal Shem Tov, the Alter Rebbe, and Mechlal the Chassidus came to challenge that. What does it mean the Eden were B'Yisalfus? There was, many challenges, but there was a new modern world was being born. And why was the Alter Rebbe so against France, even though Begashmis would have been better for the Eden, the war with France, the Franco-Russia war, because Beruchnius, the godless France, would be very bad for Eden. Even with France losing, look what assimilation did to the Jewish people, ravaged the Jewish people. So it went to a whole new stage. Assimilation that we know today did not exist 500 years ago. And this new age has a new history, that whatever happened before the 18th century is all old-fashioned. Now, the Rebbe once told, I think, maybe it was Freiden, or there was a photographer, an Israeli photographer, who was by the Rebbe, trying to remember the details, and he was going to make a display of the pictures that he took Tishrei in Eretz Yisrael, in Tel Aviv or something. And they were going to call, and the display was called something like a picture of Jews as they were in the dark Middle Ages. In other words, Chassidim are still holding on to Menhagim from the dark Middle Ages. And the Rebbe responded. I remember the full context, but I know the answer the Rebbe gave. The Rebbe said, first of all, not everything in the Middle Ages was dark, and not everything today is not dark. So, before you use the word dark Middle Ages, be careful. It's like it's missing that everything back then was the Dark Ages. They had no science, they had no medicine, they were stupid, they were religious. Faith, they didn't use seichel. Faith is the absence of reason. It's a crutch. And again, I don't want to repeat all the arguments, but it's critical to understand. So based on that narrative, let's for argument, just for a moment, go into the devil's advocate. We don't believe in a devil, but for a moment to go into the other argument. And the other argument, that's the case. So how many Jews were in Israel, living in Israel in 1890 or 1910? The majority were the Arabs, the Muslims, because they're the ones that occupied. That's correct. If you start history in 1900. And then the Ottoman Empire lost the war, so the British and the Allies divided that whole part of the world, if you're familiar with the history. And slowly, as Jews started making their way in, the British, the Balfour Declaration and other things, they had Rahmanis and Kamuvin after the Holocaust to give the Jews a homeland. That was the UN that gave it to them. That's a narrative that's completely sheket. That's like telling a history that starts for 100 years. Based on that narrative, yeah, the Arabs were living there, they were the majority, and the Jews moved in, they became more and more, they were smarter, more aggressive, and they pushed them out. And in many ways they did. You know what they didn't do, no one mentions, is that's what America did to the Indians. And that's what the Australians did to the Aborigines. However, they killed them all. So there's no one there to resist. But that's not the case, that's not the story. The Eden is a promised land. So here you see how Rashi is so critical, not just as an answer, listimatem. It also is a different narrative. So when the Goyim will say, 1,000 years ago Rashi writes this, and Rashi brings it from Medrash, which is more than 1,000 years, so 2,000 years, the Medrash, Kamat. What does it say? That they'll say, the Goyim will say, listimatem, you're thieves. You're taking our land. And the Eibishter says, that's why I'm starting the whole Torah, not from the Chidush Alechem Bereishis Bara. The whole Torah changes its order to tell that you'll have Lasaslem Koyach Ma'asav Higid La'amei Lasaslem Nachlos Goyim, to tell them Kol Ha'eretz HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And he gave it to the Goyim, and he gives it to who he wants to give it. He took it from them and gave it to the Eden, which implies, by the way, that 99% of the planet is given to the Goyim. It's a pretty big part of the world. Israel is the size of New Jersey. But he gave it to the Eden. And that's what you should tell them. Because there's no real other argument. Take away Rashi, take away Bereishis Bara, then the story you can say begins in 19th century, 20th century. And then you have the narrative that so many people buy into. And why do they buy into it? First of all, they may not even be aware of the bigger story. Secondly, it fits generally the scientific narrative that you don't need God. Why? Don't bring God into the picture. Ironically, the whole war is about God, because that's what Muslims want. They want control of Eretz Yisrael, not because they want the oil or they want their olive groves. It's because they believe they should control the world. Islam. That's another discussion, which I don't want to go into right now. But this is how you see how the Rashi that Rebbe brings is not just, the Rashi itself is powerful enough, but it also addresses such a tremendous the argument out there. And when you say this to people, they really have nothing to say. What are they going to say? That the Jews didn't have this promised land, that Jews were never there. It's pushed not true. Now remember, irrational people don't need the rational, it will not respond to rational arguments. I don't know if you can win a debate with somebody who's either anti-Semite or just has the Ganzen Fakishiv to a completely brainwashed or programmed. But we have to know, and we have to understand it. And it's true, it is true. Is it true that Eden moved into Tel Aviv and Jaffa in the early 20th century, and yes, bought homes? But it was the Arabs that immediately saw them as enemies. It was the Mufti of Yerushalayim that went to Hitler, Yimach Shemei, to make a deal with him to try to kill all the Jews, because they didn't want Jews there. Now remember, Jews being there also reminds them that's not their land, that they're the occupiers. So the chutzpah here is, they call Eden occupiers, occupied land. The aggressor, it's the exact opposite. So when you take that into context, you understand a whole different picture. So I'm not trying to explain the enemy and explaining those that disagree, but you have to understand where they're coming from, and they're just not informed. They don't have the right information. So that's the Rashi that gives us very clear, makes that very, very clear. Now I want to talk about a few other things about this whole parsha. You know, everybody's wondering what's happening there. It's like pretty quiet right now, not quiet war-wise, but not a lot of information is coming out. People think that maybe Eretz Yisrael is backing off, the pressure of the countries now, etc., etc. I mean, from my information, not that I have big inside information, but I have pretty good information. It's the exact opposite. But I hear, Baruch Hashem, that they're planning to do exactly what they set out to do, to destroy them completely. But they're doing it very secretively. Obviously, they're not going to announce that the enemy can know exactly what they're doing. And they're moving in literally piece by piece, finding out exactly where their places are because they want to destroy it. Now, we hope that it should maintain that attitude. But this is what the Rebbe wanted. And I say again, the Rebbe, we're speaking as Chassidim, but remember, the Rebbe is based on Torah approach. The Rebbe didn't just come up with ideas, Chaz v'shalom. It's based on a Torah approach. That you don't want Muhammad, but when there's no choice, you have to go and you have to fear the Muhammad is Daf Tzazan all the way. At the same time, like I said before, the Muhammad Ruchnis, they go hand in hand. There's no stira at all. But the big challenge that a lot of people are facing is the pachad. There's a natural emotional fear that people have. Both in Eretz Yisrael and even here. And a lot of people, I know this because people direct these questions to me and they talk about their children. As soon as you see a piece of news, Rahman al-Islam, there's some things that no one should even see. Some of the images and the brutality, which can break any heart. You just hear from seasoned and veterans who've been working in the military and in medical fields for years, saying they never saw anything like this in their lives. So, I don't want to talk about what they saw, but what you see here is more than just a killing. You see here, mamish, I don't know if anything could be worse than the Nazis, but on that level, things that they did. So is it purely the hatred of Eden? Is it the hatred of Eretz Yisrael? What exactly is going on here? So we have the Ach Esav, the Klal Yadua, Esav Seina Yaakov, which is a famous sikha from the Rebbe, Purim Tavshin Chav Hei, talks about the two reasons for anti-Semitism. There's between Achashverosh and Haman, the tail and the Beir, which is again not for here, but if you want to look it up, it's interesting, very fascinating sikha of why Goyim hate Eden B'chlal. But I want to talk about what I said before, a little of history, which I think is also important to know. The Rebbe actually didn't speak about this very beferish, but there were times that he hinted to it. And there are a lot of things that I found in my own years working in the Sikhs that are like as what we call an undercurrent, like a subplot that the Rabbeim talked about, but did not speak about Mamish Begoli Mamish. So I remember the first time I came to realize it was when the Rebbe in Tavshim and Beis, he said a Maimer, Chassidus, and he brought there that the last birur in Golis will be the birur of Yishmael, the birur of Esav, and the birur of Yishmael. So I remember when we wrote up the Sikhs then, and the Maimorim, I looked it up for the Marmikemis, and I found then, it's based on Maimorim from Tavshin Tes, Pesach Tavshin Tes, Kel Deidi from the Frierdiker Rebbe, which in turn is based on Maimorim Pesach of Tafresh Samach Tes, from the Rebbe Rashab. So knowing that the Rebbeim always spoke about things, even though they didn't say it beferish, but Maimorim were also said to be Mezachich Sa'avir. And Maimorim were always said also to correspond to events in the world. So even though the Rebbeim didn't always say it beferish, but you look at Maimorim, you'll see different times they spoke about things that were a way like either Magdim Refuah Lamaka or some form of Tikkun or some birur of the Umes of that time. So I looked up what happened in history in Tafrei Samach Tes and Tavshin Tes and Tavshin Mem Beis. So working our way back, Tavshin Mem Beis was the first Intifada. That's when the Rebbe came out also Mitzvah Sefer Torah, and especially that every Yeshava should have an os in the Sefer Torah. The Rebbe then said, clearly every os will protect. He was very upset that the Askanim in Eretz Yisrael were not moving quickly. He said, Mamish mekem matzel zayin nefoshes. The Rebbe used those words. And one of the Fabrengens, the Rebbe said, 300 a jeder Soldat, pashe beteva, hat an osna Sefer Torah, damals ist, stellt sich vor, damals ist, der Szene said 304,805 Soldaten mit him. Because that's the amount of letters in the Sefer Torah, 304,805. The Rebbe said it twice. Very kochzich then in Mem Beis. That was the first Intifada with the Lebanon, all kinds of mices there. Tavshin Tes is right after Tavshin Ches. Mamish that Kufa. And Tafrei Samach Tes is more or less when the Ottoman Empire, which was the empire that ruled the whole land of where Eretz Yisrael is today, and Lebanon, and Syria, and Egypt, and Iraq, and a big part of the northern Africa, ruled for a good few hundred years, and when they were destroyed, that's when all these new situations began. That's also when oil was discovered in Saudi Arabia, in the Arab world, by Western companies, which of course gives them the wealth, or else they'd just be having donkeys and camels. But Kitzer, in each of these kufis where there was a change in history, something was happening in that part of the world, the Rebbeim said something about, and all these Maimorim talk about the birur of Esav and Yishmael. Okay, to share with you at Zettel, I think it's around Tov Shin Mem, from I see from the Ksav Yad. So it's Zettel to Rabbi Velvel Greenglass, Olav Shalom, who lived in Montreal, from the Atfotsk Bochrim. He was considered a Makubal, a big Makusha to the Rebbe. There's a lot of letters from the Rebbe to him. He writes to the Rebbe like this, that he read in a Maimer, which Maimer, Vehechrim, not Vehechrim, or Matzazu. One of the Maimorim of the Rebbe Marash, I think it's Matzazu. He quotes it, where it says that Avram, next week's Parsha, Avram is mispal to the Ebesh to Lu Yichya Yishmael Lefonov. He's mispal for his son Yishmael. We know Yitzchak was obviously the Ben the one that would ultimately build Am Yisrael, but still, Yishmael was still Avram's son. So the Rebbe Marash adds, Va'af sheyoda Avram. Listen to this. We're talking now Tofresh Lamed Aleph, which corresponds to 1871 approximately. The middle of like nowhere in this whole parsha. He writes, Af sheyoda Avram mashe yasi Yishmael ba'achris hayomim. Nevertheless, he was still mispal lu yich Yishmael lefon. So Rabbi Greenglass asked the Rebbe, what is this Maimer referring to? What is he going to do ba'achris hayomim Yishmael? That's what he asked the Rebbe. And the Rebbe responds, Rabbi Greenglass responds, Ulai hakavona l'zeya seif pashas va'era. I'll tell you what it says there in a moment. Then he continues and says, V're'ei zeya seif pashas balak. The Rebbe writes, V're'ei zeya seif pasha balak, V'opiyut Yisrael Nesha, which is from the third day of Slichus, which, by the way, is the day right after 9/11, that it says, what's the Lashon Kilo? What does he say there? Seir v'chesnei, which is, of course, Arem's Kilo means he'll destroy. Seir is Esav, and chesnei is father-in-law. Who's his father-in-law? Yishmael. So the Rebbe writes, V'oid. The V'oid is important. You'll see in a moment why. So when I saw this settle, I couldn't believe it. I went to look up, what does it say in the Zayars? So Zayar say Pasha Ve'era, Mamish Nevuah. And I'm not exact, you can look it up, I'm giving you the exact, it's the last page, it's Ahmed Beis, I don't know Daf already, but say Pasha Ve'era. The Zayar says that the Sar of Yishmael comes to the Eibishter and tells him, 1 second, you gave all the barachas to Yitzchak, but Yishmael is also Mohel. He's also Nimel, Avram Mald Yishmael. So he also has a bris, b'psare. So he deserves schar for that. So the Eibishter answers, you're right, but since he was Nimel, Leben Shleish Asrei, not L'Shmeni Yomim, because Yishmael was 13 when he was the bris, so I'll give him schar, but only for a few hundred years. That I'll have some control over my holy land, Eretz Yisrael. And after these few hundred years, the schar will be over. So the Zayah says. And there'll be a wars fought over this part of the world. And wars between Esav and Yishmael, Edom and Yishmael, which is essentially between the Western Christian world and the Muslim Arab world. And after all these wars, they will both hurt each other. And it'll be, I think, Yisrael Esachayel. The Eden will rise, and that's when Mashiach will come, and it's Yisrael will be given to the Eden. That's the Yosef Pasha Ve'era. So Rabbi Greenglass is suggesting what the Rebbe Marash says, Masha Yasi Yishmael B'achris Hayom, is referring to these wars. Seif Pasha Balak, says similar idea. There actually, after 9/11, people quoted that Zayar. I don't know if they knew the Rebbe settled, But they quote it because the Zohar talks there very beremes, but it talks about two towers falling. It talks about towers falling. The Rebbe zeichens that. And of course, the Piyut says it clearly. That Yishmael and Esav will be destroyed because they were enemies of Eden. Why the V'oid? So the V'oid tells me, those that know the klolim of the Rebbe's Tziyunim, that there's a lot more to be said on this. It's not just a few, 2-3 Maramekemis. V'oid means there's a lot more to be said. So I realized from that it just confirmed that there's a whole story going on that we don't see Begoli. And that is, in the big picture, as the Rebbe Rashab in Tofri Samach Tes and Tovshin Tes and Tovshin Membei, but especially in Tofri Samach Tes and especially in Tovshin Tes, Barichas Gdela, that the final bitter is Esav and Yishmael and the battles that will be fought with them. So Esav is essentially the Christian Western Roman world that I mentioned. America and the Western world all come from Edom. And then there's the other, the Yishmael. So even though the Rebbe does say Yishmael today is not direct descendants from there, but that's a direct lineage. But generally, that region. And there in the Maimonim he talks that, what does it mean in Aveda? Yishmael and Esav, interestingly, connected to Basiligani. That's Netzach and Heid of Klippa, is Esav and Yishmael. Netzach means when you don't have Ava v'yira, Chesed and Gvura, B'shleimus, like in B'zman HaBayis, we have Midas HaNetzochen, the determination, like he speaks in Basiligani, of the Anshe Chayil, the Midas HaNetzochen, just to win the battle. And Heid is Poshet Heidah. Even if you don't have Keiches Primim and you have all the Giluyim of Ava v'yira, like I mentioned, but Heidah means Kabbalah Sel, like a soldier that goes Kabbalah Sel. That's the Aveda, Ikvas the Mashiach, the last bitter. So the bitter of Esav and Yishmael is through Midas HaNetzochen and Midas HaHeid. You can look up the Maimorim, it's Barichas there. So why am I saying all of this? Obvious, very obvious. Even though there's a war to be fought and there's a Pekuach Nefesh involved, and we're not going now into just the Haskalas of what says in Maimorim, but remember, everything starts from Teira. Staka Baraisa Bara Alma. When the Rebbe spoke, Tov Lamed Al, by the Yom Kippur War, so he said that Niva v'lo man Niva, also the siyum he made, Vav Tishrei Den, a Masechta Chala. You know, the Masechta the Rebbe doesn't make a siyum every day on. And he said, because Beremez is there, talks about Alexandria, Mitzrayim, talks about Damascus in Syria. And the Rebbe said, Istaka Baraisa Bar Alma, all the battles, everything begins in Teira. So B'meila, when we understand the birurim that we need to achieve, in some way, it is the birur of the Sar of Yishmael, the Sar of Esav, and the Sar, of course, Mechol, of Eden. So when you look at all these Zayas, and you look at all the birurim Mechsidis, you see there's a much bigger narrative going on. Again, I don't want to make sure I'm being sensitive, because right now, there are people sitting Shiva, Chmona Litzlan, they're still open, the blood has not yet dried from these massacres. So it's important to keep in mind that's where we are. But still, at some point, we have to understand also the background, so to speak. What's the story behind the story? The bigger war at stake here. So in many ways, our shlichus, to put it perfectly blunt, is to teach people what the true story is. And the story is there's an Eibishter in the Welt. And it's not just a land. Yes, Shin Chav Tes applies simply Mitzvah Pekuach Nefesh. And we have to do everything to protect our children and our men and women and innocent people. That's not even a shayla. But it's a lot deeper than that. We're talking about here, Mamish the Tachlis Habriya, that this is going to lead to Mashiach. Why it has to come when we were told already by the Rebbe so many times, Lo Yeh Eid, and Mashiach is Mamish Ot, 30 years ago already. I don't have answers to those questions. These are questions that, like the Rebbe himself said, Chaptaka Kasha. We don't have questions, like when Mrs. Lapine was murdered and so on. So we have many questions, but that doesn't mean we get paralyzed. We're soldiers. Yetzim Melchemes Beis David. And our job is to understand what is the true narrative and share it. That ultimately, behind the scenes, we need to understand that the Ge'en Yankiv, it's not just we're protecting innocent people. Of course, these brutality, any normal person would know that you have to do everything possible to eradicate evil that could do such a thing to innocent men, women, children, elderly, babies, pregnant women, unborn babies. I mean, without going into all the details again. But there's a bigger thing here as well. It's a Milchamas Hashem. Because, as the Zohar says, Mashayasi Yishmol ba'achris hayomim. So the Rebbe Marash in his own nevuah predicted or knew that something will happen ba'achris hayomim. That's not pleasant. Is this what happened? That's what he meant in the Rebbe Marash's Maimer? I don't know. All the other terrorist attacks, the wars, but he definitely says that. And still Avram was mispal for him, because at the end of the day, Yishmael does do tshuva, bizmaneh. And we hope that they will do tshuva today here too. Obviously, like General Schwarzkopf of America said, when they said to him, how could you be attacking the Iraqis? Isn't God the one that should judge them? He says, yes, God is the one that will judge them, but we have to make sure they get there to God to be able to judge them. So our job is to get them before God, which means basically to kill them, and then God will judge them. So we're not judging anyone. We have to protect ourselves. But in the process, we have to also understand the deeper story behind it. I really believe that in these Maimorim and many places, the Rabbeim definitely spoke about it. And it makes sense why they didn't speak about it with Golei Mamish, because not everything has to be spelled out. And especially you have to deal with things on the ground. But there is a plot. The Eibishter does fear the Welt. Again, why it has to go in this way, with such Chavle Leda, I have no answer, just so we have an answer for the Holocaust. But we know for sure that Yisrael Eisachayil, the promise will be that the end will be good, and it will be the Sati Shalom Ba'aretz, Menucha and Shalom for Eden and for all people, all human beings on this earth. As the quote with the Medrash that the Rebbe often cited as well, that if the Umas Ha'elam knew the brachas that they receive from Eden, from Eretz Yisrael, from Yerushalayim, from the Beis HaMikdash, instead of attacking it, they would surround it with armies, with legions of armies to protect the Beis HaMikdash because of all the brachas that it's mamshech to the Umas Ha'elam. So it's interesting, Simchas Torah, when all this started, came after 7 days of Sukkot, 8 days, 7 days, where we spoke about what? The Shivim Parim, which is Keneged Shivim Umas. We were mispal for them. Keneged the Meshalma Parim Svasenu, the Parim that were brought in the Beis HaMikdash. So it's so ironic that the very source of bracha is what, of course, the enemy attacks, but that's not surprising. So the end will be good, and we should really be zeichet to all these brachas that should be fulfilled. Begolei, Tevanir Vanigla, should only hear good news, and the Gula Hamitis Vashleim. Huh?